Okay, so we are going to be looking at the three histories, and we are going to be looking at the history of the earth from Eden to Eden. So I'm going to be sharing my screen. Can someone confirm if you're seeing my screen?
Yes, we can.
Yes,
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. So I'm going to be looking at the Okay, so I'm going to be looking at this, the history of the earth from Eden to Eden. And basically, when you're looking at this history, we can see that there are three cases that, in a way, define the history of the earth. So when you're looking at the reform lines, we can see that we have four main reform lines, the Alpha and the Omegas. We have the Alpha history of the earth, which is the line of Moses, then the Omega of ancient Israel, which is the line of Christ. And when you're looking at modern Israel, the Alpha is the Millerite history, then the history of the 144,000, which is our history, is the Omega history. So in doing that, we are going to first to define what a chiasm is. So this is going to help us in our study, because when you look at the history of the earth, it is a chiasm. So in order for us to have a better understanding of where we are coming from and where we are going, we need to define what a chiasm is. So here, if someone can just read for me, please, so that this lesson will be a participatory one, not only me talking. Can somebody just read for me?
Okay. Chaotic pattern is a literally technique in a narrative, motifs, and other textual passages. A chiasm is a mirror. Whatever is in front of the mirror is reflected back in the opposite direction. The example is using A and B. If A and B are in front of the mirror, what would come back would be not A and B again, but B and A. The chiasm would then be A, B, B, A.
Okay, thank you very much. So this definition is explaining what a chiasm is. And from this, we have the mirror effect. If you take a mirror and look at yourself in a mirror, the last thing will be the first to be reflected. That's what is being explained here. If you write A and B and put a mirror in between, what you are going to see in the mirror is not A and B, but you start to see B, then A. So it will be like a flip over. The things on the first side will be flipped on the second side. So that's basically what a chiasm is. Hope it explains well what I'm trying to do here. So let's move forward. So I'm going to look at the examples of chiasms from the Bible. So I'm somebody who like to interact a lot when I'm doing a lesson. So can somebody just give us an example, one example of what a chiasm, of one chiasm from the Bible? Hello, can somebody just think of it? Just think of any Bible verse where we have this scenario where the things that were said on one part of the verse are actually a flip over of the first part.
Melanie?
Yes.
I'm not sure, but Daniel 11:14.
Okay. Yasha, can you explain Daniel 11:14?
Okay, it says, at the time of the end shall the king of the south push at him, and the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind with chariots and okay. So let me try to write it down. but we've got him and we've got south and him, then him and we've got north and him, then him and north, right? On Daniel 11:40. So
okay, yeah, that's it, Nyasha. Or maybe
Yeah.
you can just go back to the verse and see the first part of it. And at the time of the end,
shall the king of the south push at him? South,
yes.
then him, right?
Mm-hmm.
Eh.
Then what?
Then him, then south.
Him, then?
Can you open the Bible for me?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, someone can add to what Nyasha is saying.
Is it the north?
Okay. Sidri said it is the north. Okay. Good. So if somebody can just read the verse for Nyasha, then we clarify this, then we move on.
Are you drawing that, Melania? I can't see it.
Okay. Oh, I wasn't drawing it.
Oh, no, that's
It's
fine.
actually
I
part
was
of the
thinking if you were
study.
writing- That's okay. If you're writing it down.
Yeah. I was writing it down on my notepad. Okay, can somebody read the verse? Can you read the Bible here with me?
Okay, I'm there on the verse. Okay.
Yes.
And at the time of the end, shall the king of the south push at
Mhm.
him, and the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind with chariots and with horsemen and with many ships.
So
And he shall enter into the countries and overflow and pass over.
Okay.
Yeah.
So are we seeing a chiasm there? Can you explain the chiastic structure?
Okay, so I've got king of the south pushing at him, and the king of the north pushing against him. Right? Yeah. So the him and him becomes a okay, we've got south him, then north him, right? Yeah. So the him and him becomes a chaotic structure.
Okay.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure if I have explained well.
Okay, thank you, Nyash, for that. For the sake of time, the king of the south shall push at him. Then the verse in the second, like the second time, it goes like, and the king of the north shall come against him. So this first him is the king of the north, and the king of the south is the second him on the other side, right? So yes, it's a chiasm, but in terms of structure, it needs us to explain who the first him is so that we can get that chiastic structure straight. I don't know if you got that.
Yes, I do.
Okay,
that's fine. Thank you. So let's move on.
Oh, I was going to say another example. I was just Googling it because I was thinking about this the other day and thinking, wow, I couldn't think of one verse, and Daniel 11:40 is a good one, but it's more complex perhaps than some of them. And you think we should have a list of these. So if anyone comes up with them in the next few days, just put them on, send them to me because I'm looking for them. And it's quite hard to find when you haven't got a list. And what do you search for? But I just Googled it and it said the Sabbath is made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So that's perhaps an easier.
Thank you very much.
To see, yeah.
Thank you very much, Emma. That's one of the examples that I have here with me.
Oh, yes.
So here, chiasms can be seen in the Bible, both in the Old Testament and the New Testament. And I'm going to start with this one. I'll come to that one, Emma, the one you've given. So I'm going to start with Matthew chapter 10, verse 39, which says, he that findeth his life shall lose it, and he that loseth his life for my sake shall find it. So if you look at this verse, we have there a semicolon or a colony. There are two parts to this verse. The first verse is talking about finding life and losing life. The second part is talking about, the first thing is talking about is losing life, then finding it. So this is a chiasm, and here, this is how it goes. The first half is, if you find life, you lose it. The colon is the middle point, and on the other half, it says, if you lose life, you will find life. So both sides have the same words, but the second half is flipped. So that's basically what a chiasm is. So I've put this one in a diagram so that we can all understand what I'm saying here. So this is our chiasm for Matthew chapter 10, verse 39. Find life, lose life. The other side, this line here, the middle line that is over here, it's representing a mirror. If you put a mirror here, instead of starting with finding life, it starts with losing life. So the last thing to be talked about will be the first thing to be shown on the other side. Then the first to be talked about this side will be the last on the other side. So this is how Matthew chapter 10 verse 39 is a chiasm. Hope this is more understandable.
I thought if it was a chiasm, you know, where you've got find life and two find lives, I would have thought you would have put find life on the first line, and then the other line you would have put lost life, rather than put them two in the middle. You see what I mean? The first line that you've got find life, the one that you've drawn all the way around to the other side, I thought you would have put lost life there.
Okay, that's fine. So what I'm doing, can I explain myself here?
Yeah.
Let's suppose this is a line. Let's put a line here below the, like the words. If you put a line here, that's literally what the verse says, right? If anyone finds life, you will lose the life. If somebody lose their life for my sake, will find their life. Do you see that?
Yes, okay.
Yeah, so I've literally left the other words that are in between this, and I've taken the key words that I want and put them down like this. So this mirror here is showing that the first thing, let's pretend there's no second side, this one, right? It's only this. So now when you put this mirror, that's when we have to now see this part here. The concept is, the first thing to be talked about will be the last thing to see on the mirror. The last thing will be the first to be seen on the mirror. It's okay now? Okay,
Yeah.
I can see
Yeah.
some. Yeah, thank you for the contributions in the chat. I've seen them. Genesis 9:6, Psalms 1 verse 2. Yeah, so let's move on. So examples of chiasm from the Bible, we have taken that one. Now the second one is Mark 2 verse 27, about the Sabbath, the one that Emma mentioned before. So, and he said unto them, the Sabbath was made for men. Sorry. And he said unto them, the Sabbath was made for men and not men for the Sabbath. So this one is a chiasm. And if you look at this verse here, like as it is on the line, the first half is the Sabbath was made for men. And the comma is the middle point here. And after the comma, men, and not here, that's the comma, and not men for the Sabbath. So these ones I have put in red are the keywords that I want from the verse. So it's talking about the Sabbath, then men, then Sabbath. You see, the first thing was to be talked about in the verse was the Sabbath. To say the Sabbath was made for men, and men was the second. And now on the second part of the verse, it start talking about the men, then the Sabbath. So the men, just before the comma, was the second subject to be discussed. And that subject was the first on the other side. So this is an example of a chiasm again. So both sides, we have the same words, but the second half is flipped. I've put it as well in a diagram like this one. The Sabbath was made for men, and not men for the Sabbath, you see? So this is how it's gonna look like when you put a mirror. The third one is Deuteronomy 22 verse 5. The woman shall not wear that which pertaineth unto a man, neither shall a man put on a woman's garment, for all that do so are an abomination unto the Lord thy God. We are focusing now on the first part of the verse before the colony. So the first part, our colony is over here, and everything that is before this is the first part of the verse. So it's talking about, I know this verse, it might not be talking about literal clothing, like how people dress, but what I want us to see the chiasm in this, in the structure of this verse. It's talking about woman, man, woman, right? So the chiasm, the first half of the chiasm is women don't wear what a man wears. The middle point is the comma. Then the second half is saying men don't wear what women wear, basically. So even though this verse, like I've said, isn't talking about clothes, we just want to see the chiastic structure in that. So I've put it as well on this representation here: woman, man, then woman. So based on these three witnesses, we've seen that the Bible basically is full of chiasms. Whether you are in the Old Testament or you are in the New Testament, you can see that chiasms are always used. And chiasms are one of the aspects of parable methodology that we use as a movement. So now we want to look at the history of the earth from Eden to Eden, and we are going to see how God have used the chiastic structures to explain the history of the world, to explain how things that have happened in the past are going to be mirrored in the last days of the earth's history. So there are a number of ways that we can use to look at the history of the earth. And normally we talk about the history of the earth as a line of progression from Eden to Eden. We are coming from Eden, and in the end, Eden will be restored. So our lines start from Eden, and it goes back to the new earth where Eden is going to be restored. So this is how we normally portray the history of the world, as a line. So we are going to see that in that line, there are a lot of chiasms that best explain, or that best mirrors, the start of the earth's history and how it's going to end. So Eden to Eden, which is the line of restoration, is a chiasm. And that is what we are going to be looking at in this lesson. Any questions so far? Or any additions?
I was going to ask Melania, I don't know if you would cover this later, but what do you think the purpose of that is then, of the chiasm? Because sometimes we look at them and we think, okay, there's a pattern there, but we don't get much from it. Or could you, is it different from different chiasms? I don't know how you see it, whether you're going to touch on that.
Okay, that's fine. So that's where we are going in this lesson.
Okay,
we are going to see how these chiasms are going to help us to understand the history of Eden to Eden.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so here, like I've said, there are three main cases that best explain the history of the earth. Not saying that those are the only cases, but these ones are the main ones that can define where humanity is coming from and where humanity is going to. So the first one is the sin of Eve, and not I don't know how everyone takes it, but for me to say the sin of Eve is somehow not well. Like you're saying these are two people that have sinned, but we are pointing it to say it is the sin of Eve. I don't know, maybe it's because Eve as the one who started with the sin or something, I don't know. But I'm going to just take it as it is the sin of Eve. So if we go back to Eden, we see that there is a sin that had the effect of sexism. And this sin is normally known as the sin of Eve. And this one has the effect of sexism and gender inequality. So we know that according to Genesis chapter 3, there is an issue of Adam and Eve eating the forbidden fruit. And Eve was the first to get the fruit, then gave it to Adam. Then because of that, God has to give them a curse. And they had given a number of things that would restrict their freedom as humanity in the Garden of Eden. But of all these, like how they were cast, there is this main thing that was given, and this defines the condition of the world as it is now, which is called the sin of Eve. Inequality and sexism rooted from this sin, because Eve was now told to submit to Adam. So because of that, we can see that there is inequality between the men and the women and the woman. But we know that when God created them, he created them equal. Adam and Eve were equal when they were created by God in the garden. But now, because of this sin, Eve is told to submit to Adam. So there is inequality there. Eve is a female submitting to a man. So the effects of this was the sin of was sexism and gender inequality. So this is the first one of the cases. So now we want to look at the second one. I don't know if anyone has something to add on the first one before I go to the second one. Okay, I'll take the silence to mean that no one has something to say. So the second one is the sin of Cain. So after inequality was broken in Eden, equality was broken in Eden. Sorry.
I'm being forced to say my point here of staying inside.
Okay, that's fine. You can go on.
What was I going to say? Yeah, was it forced? You know, what was I saying? Oh, the curse. It was a curse from God. The woman was cursed, but we kind of blame all the men now, don't we? But God cursed the woman. Curse upon the woman. Anyone disagree with me?
Does God put the curse on the woman? No, that's the wording.
Sorry, Natalie, please repeat what you said about.
I'm just wondering what people's thoughts are. Did God put a curse upon women? And you know that, but we blame the men, rightly so. Sexism is, we blame the men, yeah. But I'm just wondering about. Oh, I don't know.
I think the sentiment was that you felt like God cursed the woman, so why are we blaming the man when it was the woman's fault because God cursed her? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, but I actually, what you were saying before, Melania, I believe that it was both Adam and Eve was the sin, and so we say Adam sinned, which is both Adam and Eve. But I'm just wondering about the curse on the woman.
But Marshall's made a point.
Yeah, somebody's written in the chat. I think the curse in Eden was much more of a prediction of what would happen in the future.
And that's how we read curses.
Say that again.
That the curse was a prediction of what would happen in the future. Like, not so.
It's like cause and effect.
Yes, yeah.
So although the curse,
but do you think that men and the patriarchs see that as God wants, you know, this is the way they see it, as a punishment from God, not as a cause and effect? That's what I was trying to get at. Men see it as a punishment. You know, God said, you know, you're under me. Where actually God just said it's a cause and effect. There's nothing we can do about it. It's just how it will unfold.
Yeah.
So,
sorry, carry on.
Okay.
So are you saying, Natalie, that you said men see it as a what?
Men see it, you know, down the line from the very beginning as this, you know, this is how God wanted it. This is the curse type of thing on women. where actually it was the cause and effect of the sin itself by both of them.
So that would mean both of them. It's the cause and effect of both Adam and
Yes.
Eve. And men blame women.
Yes.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, thanks.
Yes.
I wanted to add the man's cursed as well. I mean, there is a curse predicted on
Yes.
the man about the sweat of his brow on the
Yeah.
ground. So it's not just the woman. The consequences.
Okay, so
So thank you for the contributions. Thank you, Marshall. Thank you for the message in the chat. Okay, so basically, this sin, like the first sin you're talking about, the sin of Eve, instead of bringing peace and harmony between the men and the women, it was now conflicts all the way, right? Because when they were created by God, they had a mutual understanding, they were equal. But now, because of inequality, you're used to being equal with someone, and now you're being forced to say you're now below that person. Your will should be determined by him. It's hard now to adjust to such a scenario. So definitely, instead of bringing peace, we all know that sin cannot bring peace. It always brings chaos. So we can say that this was the beginning of chaos in this marriage setup of Adam and Eve. So the next one, we are going to explain this, how they are going to be mirrored in the final history of this earth, as Marshall is alluded in the chat.
So Melania, can I just make one more comment about the curse thing? I was just
Okay.
looking at it again, and I'm thinking that the way that's worded, we've read it like Eve was cursed, but we now understand that it was a consequence, but that consequence happened on all three things. So we had the serpent and that disruption, and then we have the woman, and then we have the man, and what happens to them, and the enmity between the woman and the man. And to me, if we could just summarize that now they've disrupted the relationships. So the relationship is broken between human beings and animals on one level. I know it's Satan as well. So on a deeper spiritual level, but on a practical, physical level with the whole creation. And then the relationship between the woman and the children, and the man and the earth, and that typical kind of the roles that are going to be taken now, that the woman is the mother, and she's got this thing with the children, and the man's the breadwinner, and back then it was the ground. So your family life, your interaction with all of nature, with animals, is disrupted. Your interaction with your family, with your children, is disrupted, and with your job, your occupation. So everything that was meant to be a blessing to man, his occupation, his relationships, his interaction with nature, is now all going to be disrupted and cursed. You just wrecked your relationships, basically.
Yes, amen. Okay, so now we are going to look at the second sin, which is the sin of Cain, and the effects of that sin. So after equality was broken in Eden, like what you've seen, the next thing now was the breaking of the Sabbath. So in the earth's history, like we have said, we are going to see it as a chiasm. So in the first half of the chiasm, you saw that gender equality was broken in Eden. So if we fast forward and go to the few more decades to come from the time of Adam and Eve, we are going to see that the other principle was broken. And this principle is when Cain kills his brother Abel. And when Cain was cursed by God, he left his family and he made a city. And from there, we can read from Patriarchs and Prophets 8.3. And can someone read for us? I've put it on the screen.
The Sabbath was honored by all the children of Adam that remained loyal to God. But Cain and his descendants did not respect the day upon which God had rested. They chose their own time for labor and for rest, regardless of Jehovah's express command.
Thank you. So here, Ellen White is explaining how Cain have moved away from the principles that God have set for Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. So of all the descendants of humanity by that time, it was the descendants of Cain who did not respect the day upon which God has rested, which is the Sabbath. And they had their own way of worship. So because of that, this was the first time that the Sabbath was broken, and it was done by Cain. So we saw that inequality was introduced in the first sin. Then the case of the Sabbath breaking began with the sin of Cain. And this was the first half of Earth's chiasm. So in this first half of Earth's history, or we can say ancient Israel, in ancient Israel, this is how we had the effects of these sins on this earth. So we now want to see how it's gonna look like when you put it on a line. So here, the first sin will be the sin that was committed in Eden, which is the start of the earth's history, the sin of Eve. Then the second one, and now the effect is over here. The sin of Eve brought about sexism. The second is the sin of Cain, which brought the effects of Sabbath breaking, issues to do with worship. And now we want to look at the third sin and the cases that came with that sin. So this is the sin of Ham. So this was the third sin to be introduced, and another case came on humanity. So in this sin, we see that this sin was committed right after the flood, according to Genesis chapter 9, the one that was referenced as another chiasm earlier on the chart. So because of his sin, Noah cursed Canaan, Ham's son. So Ham has sinned against his father, and because of that, Noah had to curse Ham's son, not Ham. So in Genesis chapter 9, verse 25, it reads, "Cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants shall he be unto his brethren." So in this one, it's very unfortunate that I put everything there. I wanted to ask if somebody can explain like the effects of this sin, but anyway, we can move on. So this sin, this case actually, it predicted the beginning of slavery. So after Noah's case to his grandson, racism and slavery is eventually developed between the descendants of Shem, or amongst the descendants of Shem, Ham, and Japheth. So slavery is part of racism, and racism is connected to nationalism. Let me explain on this part. So if somebody can take one person to be their slave, it means they are saying your race is just below mine. And because of that, the race that is enslaving the other one is taking itself to be a superior nationality than the others. So if you're talking of slavery, racism, and nationalism are just one in the same thing. You can't separate this thing. They're intertwined within each other. So if you look at a well-known example of slavery, is from the time of Abraham, when he and Ishmael were circumcised. The Bible says that also all the men of his house born in the house, so which means these ones are born in the house, are his own descendants, and bought and brought with money of the stranger. So these ones which are brought with money of the stranger, what are they? Are we still together?
What was the question again?
My question is, the verse says, Abraham was circumcised with all the men of his house, born in the house. Then the second part says, and brought with the money of the stranger, were circumcised with him.
And your question?
My question is, this verse is differentiated two groups. It is given two groups of people that were circumcised. Can we identify the groups there?
Are the ones who were bought with the money are the slaves?
Yes. And
the others belong are the ones of that had the money to buy the slaves.
Yes. So you see, there's an aspect of master and slave. Thank you for that, Sudre. Can you see that? Okay.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So now this is where the aspect of slavery started. Now that we have the other group that is buying the others, and we have the other group that belongs, right? So we now have the master and the slave. So Abraham, he was circumcised both with his own people, like his sons and so forth, and the slaves that he had also were circumcised, you see. So here we see that Abraham had slaves that he had brought from a stranger, and they were a different race, right? So since the case of Noah began to be manifested, racism and nationalism have been a curse on humanity. So now the sin is the sin of Ham, right? And that sin, he has the effects of nationalism and racism. So you see that the first half of the Earth's history, we have these three sins, and we have seen there the effects of these sins. In this case, the effects are the cases, right? So now we are going to take this history, put it on a line, and see.
Can I just try to understand this? So the racism, was there anything to do with color, or was it just because there's people who had the money to buy the slaves? So did it have to do with color?
Okay, over to the class. What do you think? Was it something to do with color, or is just about the ability to buy?
I think when Melania explained the parallels between nationalism and racism, it kind of answered your question in that when Ham sinned and the descendants of Canaan were prophesied to be enslaved, that was a specific nation, if we want to call it that, a specific tribe that went through this enslavement. And so if you see a nation or a nationality as being prophesied as to be slaves, you can see that as a race. So if you're thinking of black and white and etc., but in this context, it was a nation, a country, people from a certain country were prophesied to be enslaved. And then that just descends into what we would consider color-based racism. But
eventually it goes into that.
But they sides of the same coin, nationalism and racism.
So when you talk about nationalism here, because I didn't quite, what does that mean then? Is it because you feel nationalistic to your own country, or can you just elaborate?
So Canaan belonged to a specific, the descendants of Canaan belonged to a specific nation, if you want to think of it in that way. And the brethren belonged to other nations. And so they enslaved the nation of Canaan's descendants. I'm oversimplifying that narrative, but that's what nationalism is seeing another nation as being inferior and enslaving them, like Melania had described. So it's that nationalism. Your nation is better, your nation is less, so we're going to enslave your nation. In this dynamic, it was demonstrated in times of war, and that's when slaves were taken, when one nation went to go and defeat another nation. And so the slaves from that nation the people from that nation were enslaved by another nation. So that's what it's talking about, nationalism or nationalistic.
Okay.
Wars between nations.
I was going to add to that about the wars. I think one of the examples we have of where slaves came from was the fact that they took spoils of war. So when one nation conquered another, they take the people to be slaves. So I was wondering where Abraham bought them from, but whether nations were already enslaved by another nation, and then it was that they were slaves from then on.
No, because in the Roman Empire, remember how they when they brought the slaves, so-called slaves back, they allowed them to become citizens of Rome.
That was
So
Rome, though. That was later.
that was, yeah, oh no, I was just bringing that up. So you don't always become a slave.
No, but that's one way that slaves were made in that sense, or became slaves, because one nation flexed its muscles and said, we're stronger and better than you are. And now we've conquered you. We're going to make you the slaves. I suppose that is just linking into Curtis's point about that whole superior, inferior, and the nations.
Okay.
Melania, I have
Yeah.
a question about these three curses.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have a slide where you have them each laid out, and the effects, if you want to call it that?
Yes.
They are.
Okay, I'm going to share that later.
Okay. Okay, could you go to the previous slide then?
Okay, that's fine.
So
Mm-hmm.
here, when we talk about Eve, the sin of Eve in inverted commas, and the results being sexism,
Mm-hmm.
the result is that a group, no, wait, please keep that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Is that a group, if you want to say, that descends from Eve is discriminated against. Women are discriminated against under sexism. And then in this one that you just described of Ham, Ham commit a sin, and the descendants of Canaan are enslaved. So a specific group are then discriminated against.
Yes.
But then when we describe the sin of Cain, we see that Cain sinned, and the result is Sabbath breaking perpetuated, just happened again and again. It kind of feels like, or sounds like, that's different to the other two. Is that something that's a contrast, or does it mean that the result of Cain's sin needs to align to the results of the other two? I don't know if my question made sense. Because the other two, a group is discriminated against, but Cain, it's something that's affecting God. That one seems to be different to the other two. So I don't know if that's the point that's being made by this, or it would need us adjusting how we think about the results of the sin of Cain.
Okay, yeah, I get it. Yeah.
I had another thought, maybe connected to that. Sorry, Melania, you're going to answer that.
Okay, that's fine. You can go on, Emma. I'll give my thoughts at the end. Because
I was just seeing that pattern, thinking similarly, I suppose, to how can we summarize all three? I don't know if we could say, this is just another thought, that the first one affected the family, the second one affects the church, and the third one affects the nation. So it's almost like family destroyed, church destroyed, nation destroyed, just because it happens on a progressive downhill level. Because if we say the three units that make up society are family, church, nation, we talk about family being the small unit and the church, then you're part of a bigger nation. So I don't know if we saw it in that light, it would help to answer the question.
Leon's put in the chat, the other two affect how the image of God looks like. And I would say that all three of them do. That's the parable that we're learning, But for it to be a parable, the second one has to be related to humanity, because it's teaching us about God. And I don't know, I have a hypothesis, but I want to hear your thoughts, Melania.
Okay, I wanted to say the same thing that Emma explained. Like, this is how I viewed it. That the first one, it's talking about like the image of the family, how it has been broken. God created a male and a female, like in a marriage setup for that time, as equal. So we may say that two partners in a marriage setup, God created them equal. But because of this sin, there is now an issue of gender inequality. The other gender is now being put down, and the other one is now superpower. Then the second one is talking about the church. Now, how we view the church, the image of how the relationship between men and God has been distorted there. Although in the first one, the sin of Eve, we can also see that the image of God was also distorted throughout. Now, when it comes to the third one, which is the sin of Ham, it's not talking about the nation, how God has created the image of the nations to be like. God created them equal, everyone equal across the board. But now, because of this sin, we now have inequalities between the nations. That's why now we have wars and so forth. It's because of that inequality. So I'm going to explain further when you flip to the other side of the Earth's history. Now, when we are doing the restoration of Eden, because you're going to see that this same pattern is going to be flipped. Like we started with family, church, nation, and it will be the other way around now. The nation influencing the church and the church influencing the family.
Sure, we can go on to that. I think my question wasn't entirely answered, but it might be when you do the reverse.
Okay, that's fine. Okay, let's just move on and see. Okay, so let's move on. So we've talked about the sin of Ham, and now this is how it looks like. This is ancient Israel, right? And we are seeing these three sins in their effects. So we have the sin of the first sin, which is the sin of Eve in Eden, the effects of which is sexism. The second one is the sin of Cain, the effects, Sabbath breaking, worship. Then between the sin of Cain and the sin of Ham, we see that there was a flood, right? There was a flood there, the time of Noah. And soon after the flood, that's when we see the sin of Ham, which brought about the issues to do with slavery, racism, and nationalism. So this is the first part of the Earth's history, ancient Israel. Now, when you put a mirror there, and you want to mirror these three cases, these three main cases of the world, you put a mirror, like what we have discussed before. If it's a chiasm, the last thing to be discussed here, which means the third one here, this pattern, instead of it being 1, 2, 3, we are going to start with the last one. So the last sin to be committed or the last case to be pronounced will be the first to be restored. Does it make sense?
Yes.
Thank you. So now we want to see how these cases have been reversed in this history. And please, we need to take note of this, the sea and the land aspect. The flood, what does the flood do? The flood is water that is coming on the land, and we now have two divisions, the sea and the land. We are going to explain it in the next one as we go. So these three cases, we see that there was a starting point when they were pronounced. So everything has an ending. If they were pronounced, we must see them being lifted up, being coming to an end. So how are they going to come to an end? This is how the chiastic structure is going to help us to explain how these cases have been restored. So the issues are going to repeat, as we have seen in the previous slides, that there are three issues facing the world, which are sexism, the Sabbath, and racism. And these three things, as we have seen them, we want to see how they're going to be restored. So this is one thing that the chiastic structure is going to show us. They will be restored in the history of modern Israel. Like I've alluded before, these things were pronounced in ancient Israel. So as I have started, when I started this presentation, I started by showing the four main reform lines. And I showed that the history of the earth can be best described using the four main reform lines, which is the history of Moses, the history of Christ, the history of the Millerites, and the history of the 144,000. So in a way, these three cases have been pronounced in ancient Israel. So what modern Israel is supposed to do, we are supposed to see these things restored, since we are going back to Eden. So now the issue is in what order? So here I explained the structure, how it's going to be restored. Like we started with sexism, which I have put as an A, the Sabbath B, racism C. And when they are going to be restored, they are going to come in an opposite direction. Instead of starting with A, we are going to start with C, because C was the last one to be committed and to be pronounced a case upon. So we have C, B, A instead of A, B, C. So Firstly, racism, which was the last thing here to be pronounced upon the earth, is the first one which is going to be dealt with first before anything else. So the issues to do with the Sabbath will be dealt secondly. Then lastly, the issues to do with sexism will be dealt with before we return to Eden. So we are supposed to see a line which represents this. So here, I've tried again to use this picture here to elaborate the three cases and how they are going to be restored. So we are here in Eden and we want to go back here to Eden. So Eden is being restored from Eden to Eden. Here we are in Eden, all things were perfect. And now there comes the sin of Eve, which caused the sexism, gender equality. And from there, we had the second one, the sin of Cain, which caused the issues to do, which is the effects to do with worship and Sabbath breaking. Then the third one, the sin of Ham, brought about slavery, racism, and nationalism. So when you are going now to the other side, this is the path that you are going to follow. From here, Eden, we walk through the path, now coming back to Eden here. So how is it going to be like? The last here, the last effects, which are slavery, racism, and nationalism, are the first to be restored here. They are supposed to be restored first, followed by issues to do with the Sabbath, worship, and lastly, we are going to see issues to do with gender inequality and sexism being restored so that we will be restored back as humanity to Eden. So now we are going to be looking at the other side of this chiastic structure. So the reversal of slavery, racism, and nationalism. Racism was the issue we all know in the history of the Millerites, like what we discussed earlier on in the week, during the week at the prayer meeting. So we know that all of Earth's history is a chiasm, like I have discussed earlier on. So we have looked at half of it. Now this is the second half. So gender equality, Sabbath breaking, slavery, they were all introduced in the first half. Now we are going to see them being restored. So how are they going to be restored is the issue here. So like I've said, the last case was slavery and racism. So we must see this being restored first. So when was slavery abolished?
1863.
1865.
Okay, we have two answers. All right, for the sake of time, we are going to move on. So on January 1, 1863, in the midst of the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, which said that all slaves in southern states were from then on free. So this is the Millerite history, and we are in 1863, which is the second coming for the Millerites. We all know, right, according to the lines, if you draw the lines, 1863 is the second coming. So slavery or racism was the main issue in the Millerite history. The Fugitive Slave Act, remember, the 1851. So this act isn't the only thing that marks the effects of the end of slavery, though. There are a lot of things we know. But throughout the Millerite history from 1798 to 1863, we see the issue of slavery dividing the states and Protestantism. Now we are coming back to the question that Curtis asked. It was about the one that Emma elaborated and say, these cases, they're starting with the family, church, and nation. Now we have flipped over the issues. We are starting with the church, nation, and family. So when now we want to restore these cases, we are now starting with the last thing that was committed, and it has to do with the states. You see, it is the states. The issue is dividing the states, not the family. So now it's starting with the state, with the bigger entity, narrowing down to the smaller entity. So we see that slavery was dividing the United States and Protestantism. What is Protestantism? What is it? Did anyone get my question?
protesting against Rome.
Yes. So what is it? Is it a state? Is it a family? Is it a church thing? What's that?
Yeah, church.
Church, you see. So we have, thank you very much. So we have the states and the church. So this sin is dividing the church and the state, but specifically starting with the nation, with the church, with the countries, which is the United States. That's where we find Protestantism. So you see, God had this way of showing how these sins, when they are being restored, instead of them starting with a smaller entity, just like how it started in Eden with only two people, Adam and Eve, now it's starting with the bigger entity, narrowing down to the smaller entities. So slavery was their greatest test, and being the first of the three cases to begin to be restored in the second half of the Earth's history. So it's going to look like this. Now slavery is fixed in this history. Efforts have been made, though we can't say there's no more slavery at this point in time. Yeah, they are there, but the good thing is almost all the states of the world have laws in place to try and protect the minority races, or to try and do away with racism at all cost. So we can safely say racism has been dealt with or has been restored. So here, 1, 2, 3, they're the cases. We put a mirror there. Now we have 1798 to 1863, the issues to do with racism. Ending slavery was the test in the Millerite history. And you remember, we talked about the flood before, just before the sin of what? Of Ham. So here, just before the restoration of the sin of Ham, we are supposed to see something to do with the flood. So can someone read Revelation 13 verse 11 for us?
Sure, I can read it. Let me just go there.
Okay, thank you.
Revelation 13 verse 11. I'm going to ask a question, if that's okay, after I read the verse. But Revelation 13 verse 11 says, and I beheld another beast coming up out of the earth, and he had two horns like a lamb, and he spake as a dragon. That's okay. Carry on. Sorry, just so I understand more what the point you're making.
Okay, so here, at the time of Noah, they were on the land, right? And they want, okay, what I'm trying to explain is that during the time of the flood, isn't it, we had a flood, right? At the time of Noah. Soon after the flood is water, right? Water covering the earth's surface. So now when the water was gone, what did they have? They had the land. So in a way, they were in a sea, like flooding, and now they go to the land. As they go to the land, that's when this sin was done and this case pronounced. Now we are on the other side of the earth's history. What are we? Before, people were on the sea, and this one is a prophecy, Revelation chapter 13, verse 11. Can someone just explain this? What does it mean to be on the sea and now going to the land? Is Ignatius here?
Yes, I'm there.
Okay. Can you just try and explain this verse for us? Revelation 13, verse 11.
Okay, from our old understanding of 1311, the beast from the sea, we believe it to be Europe, and the beast from the land, we believe it to be the US. So the beast from the sea is going out of the prophetic the prophetic picture, and we have the beast from the land coming up now into the into Bible prophecy. Then as it comes up into Bible prophecy, it begins the sin of slavery, racism, and nationalism, because we see that the moment they get out of their ships, which were obviously on the sea, getting out of the ships into the land, which is the land of America, they began to enslave the natives in America, the Red Indians. And they began to think themselves as more superior than all the natives. So they become nationalistic, you see now. So that is how I see it. The freedoms that they wanted so much that they made them run away from the sea, from Europe through the sea to the land of America. They couldn't, they were not ready, they were not willing to extend those freedoms to the natives in America.
Okay, thank you very much. Is there anyone who would like to add or say something about this?
Not on the commentary, just on the structure. You have the sea and land before slavery, and the sea and land before the sin of Ham. From what you explained to us at the beginning, doesn't it have to be a mirror?
Sorry, it doesn't have to?
Should it not be a mirror? What you explained to us at the beginning, that they shouldn't follow each other, but instead should be reversed in a chiasm.
Yes. So when you put a mirror there, Ketes, let's put a mirror on that, the middle line there. We are supposed to start with the sin of Ham, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. But before the sin, what is there?
There's the flood.
The flood, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah. So the concept here is before this sin was pronounced, or before the sin was committed and the case is pronounced, we are supposed to see something to do with the sin, with the sea and the land. So here we have the sea, which is the flood. Then they goes to the land. When they reached the land, that's when the sin was like done and the effects came. And here, when you go to the other side, America, can we say the beginning of America? This is where America began. And when they reached the land, what did they do? They started with this slavery thing, but within their history, within the history of the Millerites, that's when we see the issues being discussed and ending slavery at all cost.
Okay, so you're not including the sea and land as part of the chiasm. You're tying it to slavery.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you. So let's move on. So the Sabbath being restored. So true worship was lost sight of during the time of Cain and his descendants, and the Sabbath, we see it being restored later. So Cain's sin was the second major sin, and we have seen its results. And now, after slavery and racism, which were dealt in the Millerite history, we are supposed to see the issues of the Sabbath being dealt with, being in the Millerite history or even after the Millerite history. So we see that the issue is being extended from the Millerite history to the early history of Adventism. So if we look back in 1846, Ellen White began to keep the Sabbath, and it began to be one of the main topics of the early Seventh-day Adventist Church. So we see that even though the Millerite history was mainly focusing on the issues to do with slavery, we see that the issues to do with worship were even included. though they were not much talked about. So we can even see and trace the history of the Sabbath from the Millerite history before 1850, and it stretches up to the history of the 1888, where we see A.T. Jones and the other, among other Americans, going into the Congress, trying to oppose the bill that was put in place. So the Adventist people, they believe that the government should not force people to worship God in a certain way, even if that way seems right. And this is the time when the Great Controversy was written, and Ellen White in the Great Controversy clearly showed out that the Sabbath would be an issue of the Sunday law at their time. And efforts to enforce Sunday worship were already in progress. So you see, these issues, they seem to be the testing times of each and every dispensation. If you go back to the Millerite history, issues to do with slavery, we know that the sin of Ham was being restored, the curse was being lifted, and 1850, their Sunday law was to do with slavery. So the case that is being restored, normally it will be the testing like issue of a particular time. So 1850, the testing issue is slavery, which is the sin that is being tried to be restored. Now the 1888 history issues to do with the Sabbath, and now the Sabbath seems to be a testing issue at that time, the 1888 history. So now we want to move on to the third, or to the first, the first being restored, which will be the last to be restored in the Earth's history. So
Melania, Curtis has got his hand up.
Oh, sorry.
That's okay. I don't know if you can see it.
So if we could go back to the previous slide. So I think this ties to the question that I had brought up at the beginning, which was that when we think about the 1888 history, I know Ellen White speaks of it when dealing with the church specifically, speaks of it about a Sabbath issue. But with regards to America, we know fundamentally it wasn't a Sabbath issue. It was to do with religious intolerance, if we want to put it that way. And it seems that in each of these cases, it's dealing with the societal issue, not necessarily dealing with the issue related to the church that impacts the church. Sure, it does, as it filters down, but it's more so the societal issue. So when we think about Cain and when Cain killed Abel, I would suggest that it's in the same thing. It has to be something that affects society that's going to be restored, and not necessarily that relationship with God. I know it does because we're talking in parables, but my suggestion is that that curse isn't directly related to Sabbath breaking. That's a byproduct of the curse. Its primary outcome is, we could say, discrimination on the basis of religious intolerance. So Cain killed Abel because Abel worshipped God differently, simplistically. And so that's what we see in 1888 now, where the Protestants are going to discriminate against Catholic, Jews, Adventists, anyone else who has a religion differently to theirs. And that falls into Leon's concept of all these three things are related to how we view God. But when regarding the test, it's related to something here on earth. So in 1888, it's something here on earth, dealing with people. And that's what I suggest ties all these three things together. It's worship, but specifically religious intolerance against other people, slavery, other people, sexism, other people. And the Sabbath breaking is just a byproduct of that second sin and the 1888 history. It's not the primary focus. My suggestion, I could be wrong. I'd like to hear other thoughts.
Melanie, just to let you know that you've had an hour.
So it's all right. Thank you. So should I end here? Oh
no, you can have another quarter of an hour.
Okay,
thank you. Or more. I just want to, on the back of that point of Curtis, I was thinking the same thing, that we focus on the first and third being about people and the second one being about worshiping God. But if we look at that other side of it, when you just said it has to be about society, there's an aspect that affects God and man, but it's what we focused on. So even with the sexism one at the beginning, you know, they part of the curse was the fact they lost face-to-face communion with God. So it destroyed their relationship with God, and it destroyed their relationship with the earth, with each other, with the family. So it was about relationships with both. But it's depending what the story we're telling, we focused on the Sabbath bit. Now you want to bring in the humanity bit, which I think is, I was thinking along the lines that the Sabbath, the importance of it was actually bringing people together in community as well. So that links to your point, I think, that it's connected to how they treat each other, that religious intolerance to one another is dividing groups based on their belief system. So there were free thinkers in there as well who I don't think acknowledge God. I think that we would say probably more like atheism. Don't quote me that. I can't remember what free thinker is exactly. But the point about the Sabbath being community, and that once sin comes in, you need somewhere where you can come together in a safe space. And I was thinking of the idea of refuge as well, that the family ceased to be a refuge because of sin, and then the church ceased to be a refuge because of false doctrine and that intolerance coming in, and then the nation ceases to be a refuge and slavery with all the principles of oppression everywhere that have to be undone. And so, yeah, if you see the Sabbath as the heart of the Sabbath is about people worshiping together to God. It's not about independent atoms doing their own thing, which is what we've seen in our time as well, that people say, I can worship God at home, I can do what I want by myself. And that's what I thought when you said about the quote from Cain as well, that in that time period, Cain and his descendants worked when they wanted and rested when they wanted. And when they do that, it means no one can come together, because we know now, even in our time as Sabbath keepers, it's so hard to come together with other people because they want to do everything on a Friday night and a Sabbath. And so it's really breaks down that community in society.
Right.
Emma, I just wrote in the chat, in 1888, the Protestants would have argued that that's what they wanted. No, just on their specific day. They didn't want a fragmented worship system. They wanted people to worship that way, to bring those communities, to save society from that fragmented churchy structure, or etc.
Right. Okay, so yes, that might have been how they argued it, but then we bring in the complexity level, which is freedom and equality, isn't it? The boundaries that need to happen for people to come together in a simple environment. That is that a violation, because they're wanting the freedom to do that actually discriminates against someone else. So when it brings harm to someone else, that's not based on how God operates. So that community has to come together under God's terms. And I suppose that's why the Sabbath is one reason why the Sabbath is there, because this is God's terms now. I'm going to say the day, this is the day. If you all choose to stick to that day, you'll have a relationship with me and with each other. But if you go and do your own plan, which is what they were doing, Protestant, I suppose, could argue with the Sunday, because it excludes others and discriminates against others. Obviously, I don't know. That answers the question completely.
Thank you for the contributions. Maybe what we're gonna do is we have a separate time to talk about it, or some other time in the future we have a study like discussing about how these three have affected the societies. But one thing for sure is to do with societies, because the church is in the society, the family is in the society, and societies make up states. So now let's look at the third one, sexism.
Hello, Melania. Sorry. Just before we move, let me just throw in something while people are thinking about the subject that we're just about to leave, so that you continue with your lesson. I just want to throw in something that the great controversy from the beginning, it is a controversy between truth and error. It's about God's character, but it is engulfed in this concept of what is it that is true and what is it that is wrong. So when you go to the issue of slavery, you see that concept coming in, that is it correct to keep slaves or is it wrong? Which one is truth? Which one is error? Because somebody was saying, one group was saying, if slavery was wrong, it wouldn't have made the Bible any bigger if God had added a phrase in the Bible that stop keeping slaves is now wrong. You see, truth and error. So the other group was saying there's nothing wrong with keeping slaves. The other group was saying keeping slaves is wrong. So when you come into the 1888 history as well, I am suggesting that we should see the element of truth and error also, while we incorporate everything to do with relationship with it, human and human, God and humanity, etc. But this thing of truth and error, I see it popping up over and over again. Even if you consider our history, there's this issue of truth and error where we are saying, the other group is saying, LGBTQs are wrong because of Genesis, the creation story. Feminism is wrong because of Ephesians and all the other Bible verses. You see now. So the controversy is really great in that the two groups have evidence supporting themselves that this is truth, this is error. So in 1888 as well, what I see, I see this concept of people saying we've been worshiping on Sunday for more than 1,000 years. And a small group of people that have been there for the past 40 years are saying, no, that's wrong. There's truth and error involved as well in that particular history. So while we think about it, I think it's also important to involve that aspect as well, that there's this thing of truth and error, truth and error, truth and error in each and every history of the great controversy when the issues are going to a close.
All right, thank you very much. So now the last issue, I'm left with 5 minutes, I think. So our last one will be the sin of Eve, which brought about sexism. So what does sexism look like in our time? Kenai has brought forward some of the things that I'm going to show, that I'm showing now at the slide. So our time of the end being 1989, with 3 movements that led to our time of the end: the civil rights movement, the second wave feminism, and Stonewall, which has to do with LGBTQ rights. So these 3 groups, they are the ones that led to the history, or the 1989 history, which is our time of the end. So these groups here, we have the civil rights movement, talking about equality, like race is to do with race. Then second wave feminism is about women, men and women, inequality. And now the Stonewall is talking about gender equality. So these histories, they build up until we get to our time of the end, in which case, from the time of the end, we should now be restoring or doing away with this sin of sexism and gender inequality. So it was one of the issues that we mark at the time of the end, sexism. That is why this movement is really focusing on it, and because it is the issue for today. So it's not racism or Sabbaths that is the testing issue of our time. Sabbath has been a testing issue way back then. Racism has been an issue back then. But now, here, as we are approaching the end of this Earth's history, sexism is the test of our time, and we can prove this using the chiastic structures. So homophobia is included in the issue of sexism. So this problem that began all the way back in Eden will finally be resolved before we return back to Eden. So in the end, this is how our chiastic structure, or the chiasm, is going to look like. How we started in Eden here and how we are going to end in Eden here. So there is a history from here up to here, which we tried to explain using this chiasm to show that the Earth history is a chiasm, and it can best explain how these sins, how the cases are going to be lifted as we draw closer to the end of this Earth's history. So gender equality will be an issue at our Sunday law. So our Sunday law test is something, or is everything to do with equality. so that we try and do away with sexism. So in our time, there will be some sexist activities that the government and the society at large will try and push forward so that sexism can have a stronghold in the societies. But now, as we know that it is a test of our time and we need to uphold equality at all cost. We know right now when you just take your phone and Google, there's everything to do with sexism and gender inequality. Abortion rights that are being suppressed. States are putting forth laws that try and subject women, different genders into to suppress them so that there will be gender inequality everywhere. Talk of Uganda, talk of all the other states, Zimbabwe and everywhere, and even here. So you see, we are aware that these are the testing issues of our time, and we need to support equality, gender equality at all costs. Women, LGBTQ, they have their rights. And we know that this is the testing issue of our time. So for us to be saved, we need to uphold gender equality as it has been shown by this study through the use of the chiasm. Thank you very much. This is the end of our study. I don't know if anyone has something to add or questions.
Thank you for your study. And I was just looking at one of your previous slides where you were showing the chiasms. I don't know if you can go back to there where you were showing the sea and the land.
Okay.
And I think you used Revelation 13. I don't know if you can go back. Yeah. So I was wondering if you used Revelation 12:16 to demonstrate, not that you should change it, but this is how I'm viewing it myself, to represent the sea and the land, because the sin of Ham would parallel to 1798, and the sin before the flood will parallel to the 12:60. That's if you use Revelation 12:16, because Ham, you saw the flood swallowed the earth, but in 12:60 it was the earth that swallowed the flood. I don't know if you understand what I'm saying.
Okay, thank you very much, Susan. It's Revelation 12:16. 12:16. Okay, I'll look into that. Thank you. 12:16. Okay. It's all right. Thank you. I'll look into that phase. Thank you. Okay. Thank you very much. Over to you, Emma.
Melania, if you can end with a prayer.
Okay, that's fine. Thank you. Let's pray. Dear Lord in heaven, we thank you for the Sabbath. We thank you for the time that you've given us to come and study. We thank you for the great truths that you've shown us during the study. May you open our understanding. Help us, Lord, so that when we have extra time, we go back and look at these things that we have studied this afternoon. Help us, Lord, that as we are confronted by the events of the Earth's history, as we are coming to an end, Lord, can you help us to stand by your truth and to uphold equality at all cost? We thank you for this time. Bless everyone that have joined this meeting, and may you be with us and be with us as we come, as we study and rest in this Sabbath day. We pray all this in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen.